Plato. Let's start with the giant of ancient philosophy. Born in Athens in 428 BCE, he founded the Academy, the first major center of higher learning in the Western world. What makes him so important here is how openly he connected same-sex love with truth, beauty, and even philosophy itself. In his famous dialogue, The Symposium, different speakers praise love, but it's the speeches on male-male desire that stand out. Plato, through his characters, describes these bonds as higher than ordinary attraction. The idea was simple but radical. Love between men could inspire courage, loyalty, and ultimately lead the soul upward, from passionate desire to an appreciation of eternal beauty and wisdom. That ladder of love became one of the most influential ways of thinking about desire in history. And remember, this wasn't hidden. Classical Athens already normalized such relationships, but Plato went further. He argued they had moral and spiritual worth, not just social or physical value. That elevated homosexuality from something practiced to something philosophically exalted. The long-term impact is massive. Across centuries, from Renaissance humanists to modern queer thinkers, people have turned back to Plato as one of the earliest voices suggesting that non-heterosexual love can be noble, creative, and deeply human. Even if he wrapped it in myth and dialogue, Plato set a precedent. Same-sex love deserves a place not on the margins, but at the very center of philosophy's search for truth. Xenophon. Now let's talk about another Athenian born around 431 BCE, just a few years after Plato. Unlike Plato, the philosopher, Xenophon was known first as a soldier, historian, and student of Socrates. He actually fought in wars, led armies, and then wrote about politics, ethics, and everyday Athenian life. Why is he important in this story? Because Xenophon gave us another window into how the Greeks thought about same-sex love, and he treated it as both normal and valuable. In works like The Symposium, yes, he wrote his own text with that same title. Xenophon describes men openly admiring other men's beauty, and he frames these relationships as tied to honor, bravery, and loyalty. In Constitution of the Spartans, he makes it clear that close same-sex bonds in Sparta weren't seen as shameful. They were encouraged to build trust and courage among warriors. His approach was different from Plato's mystical ladder of love. Xenophon was practical. He suggested that when guided wisely, same-sex desire could create strong friendships, discipline, and civic strength. For him, love was not a distraction, but a force that, if noble, helped men achieve virtue and even military excellence. The outcome? Xenophon reinforced that same-sex attachment was woven into respected parts of Greek society, from the battlefield to the symposium banquet table. His legacy matters because it shows us that in classical thought, homosexuality wasn't hidden or condemned. It was openly recognized as a powerful part of human bonds and collective life. Michel de Montaigne. Now we jump to 16th century France, to Michel de Montaigne, widely seen as the father of the modern essay. Born in 1533, Montaigne was a nobleman, magistrate, and thinker who shaped how Europe reimagined individuality and personal identity. His genius was writing from deep personal honesty, putting human experience at the center of philosophy. So where does LGBTQ history fit in? In his famous essay on friendship, Montaigne describes an intimacy between men that he argues is far stronger than marriage. He calls it a bond of souls, perfect and beyond explanation. He even admits that no woman could equal the friendship he once shared with his closest companion, Etienne de la Boétie. Though written in the language of his time, Montaigne clearly elevates male-male love into something noble, spiritual, and beyond ordinary categories. What makes this radical is context. Montaigne's Europe was dominated by the church, which strictly condemned non-heterosexual love. Yet here was a respected statesman and philosopher saying, certain same-sex bonds were not only natural, but among the highest human experiences. He compared them to ancient Greek ideals of friendship, giving intellectual cover for love that fell outside religious norms. The long-term impact is huge. Montaigne helped reopen the door to talking about sexuality and intimacy as dignified and deeply human. His essays influenced later humanists, Enlightenment thinkers, and eventually those who began to argue openly for LGBTQ rights. By grounding same-sex love in universal human virtue, Montaigne made it clear. These relationships were not shameful. They were among life's most profound. John Stuart Mill, born in London in 1806, was a child prodigy raised on logic, philosophy, and classical languages before most kids could even read. As an adult, he became one of the most influential liberal philosophers in history. His book on liberty is still quoted almost every time people talk about human rights. Here's why Mill matters for LGBTQ history. And on liberty, he laid down a powerful principle. The only reason society should ever restrict someone's behavior is to prevent harm to others, not because most people disapprove. That means if two adults love each other, no matter their gender, society has no right to interfere. Mill didn't write directly about homosexuality. It was too taboo in Victorian England, but his harm principle became the backbone of modern arguments for LGBTQ rights. Think about the time he lived in. Homosexuality was still criminalized under British law, punishable by prison or even hard labor. Yet Mill's philosophy gave activists a tool. You could say this love hurts no one, so why should the state deny freedom? That logic still fuels court decisions today. The long-term impact? Enormous. Mill gave us the moral language to defend private love as public liberty. From decriminalization campaigns in the 20th century to same-sex marriage cases in the 21st, his words echo. He showed that true freedom means protecting choices society might dislike. And that's the very heart of LGBTQ equality. Oscar Wilde. He wasn't just a writer. He was a cultural force. Born in Dublin in 1854, he dazzled Victorian London with his plays, poetry, and essays. He lived his life as a work of art, witty, flamboyant, and unapologetically himself. What sets Wilde apart in LGBTQ history is that he openly connected same-sex love with beauty, creativity, and truth. In works like The Picture of Dorian Gray and essays such as The Soul of Man Under Socialism, he celebrated love between men as something noble, even revolutionary. He called it, in his own words, the love that dare not speak its name, a love that Victorian society preferred to deny or punish. And punished he was. In the 1890s, Wilde's relationships with other men led to a public trial. Instead of hiding, he defended his love before the court, claiming it was natural, intellectual, and uplifting. That boldness cost him everything: his career, his freedom, even his health. Convicted of gross indecency, Wilde spent 2 years in prison with hard labor. Yet his impact reaches far beyond his tragedy. Wilde became one of the first modern figures to argue, openly and passionately, that same-sex love is not a crime, but a source of genius and humanity. His writings later inspired early gay rights movements, and he remains a global symbol of courage in the face of social prejudice. The legacy is simple but powerful. Wilde turned his life into philosophy. By refusing to deny who he was, he gave future generations the words and pride to say, "Our love has dignity too." Magnus Hirschfeld, born in 1868 in Germany, was a physician, sexologist, and one of the very first to argue scientifically that homosexuality and gender variance are natural forms of human diversity. A gay man himself, he combined medical research with activism, earning him the nickname Einstein of Sex. In 1897, Hirschfeld co-founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, the first organization in the world to fight for homosexual and transgender rights. He spearheaded campaigns to repeal Germany's anti-gay law, Paragraph 175, and published pioneering research showing that same-sex love existed across all cultures and times. In 1919, he opened the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, which offered counseling, advocacy, and even some of the first gender-affirming surgeries. But Hirschfeld paid a terrible price. When the Nazis rose to power in 1933, they ransacked his institute, burned thousands of his books in the streets, and drove him into exile. Much of his life's work was destroyed. Yet his impact refused to die. Hirschfeld laid the groundwork for modern LGBTQ movements worldwide. By using science against stigma, he proved difference was not disease, but identity. A century later, activists recognize him as a trailblazer who dared put data and dignity ahead of prejudice. Simone de Beauvoir, born in 1908 in France, was one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. Best known for her masterpiece The Second Sex, 1949, she challenged the world to rethink gender itself. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman, she famously wrote, meaning gender roles are social constructs, not destiny. So how does this tie to LGBTQ history? By breaking down the myth of fixed gender, Beauvoir carved space for people whose lives didn't fit traditional categories. She lived this complexity herself, fiercely independent, partnered with Jean-Paul Sartre, but also openly involved in relationships with women. Her philosophy was existentialist. We are condemned to freedom, meaning we must create our identity, not simply inherit it. For LGBTQ people, that meant love and gender could be chosen, lived authentically, even in defiance of social rules. Instead of biology dictating who you are, Beauvoir showed identity is constructed by culture, and therefore it can be changed. Her long-term impact is profound. Feminism, queer theory, and trans studies all build on her insight that there is no single way to be male or female. By dismantling rigid binaries, Beauvoir gave future generations the language to argue. LGBTQ lives are not deviations. They are legitimate expressions of human freedom. Herbert Marcuse, born in 1898 in Berlin, was a German-American philosopher from the Frankfurt School, a group that analyzed society, power, and culture in the 20th century. Forced to flee Nazi Germany, he later taught in the U.S., becoming a leading intellectual voice of the 1960s protest movements. Students called him the father of the New Left. Here's why Marcuse matters for LGBTQ history. In his book Eros and Civilization, 1955, he argued that society forces sexuality into a narrow box, mainly reproduction and control. True liberation, he said, would unleash the full spectrum of human desire, what he called polymorphous sexuality. In other words, love and pleasure between men, women, or beyond traditional gender roles weren't just valid. They were a vision of a freer, less repressive world. This was groundbreaking. In the Cold War era, homosexuality was criminalized and pathologized. Yet here was a respected philosopher declaring that repressing sexual diversity was a tool of domination. For Marcuse, queer love wasn't deviance. It was a glimpse of human potential and social freedom. The long-term impact is clear. His ideas inspired feminist, gay liberation, and countercultural movements in the 1960s and 70s. Activists quoted Marcuse to argue that LGBTQ rights weren't only personal freedoms, but part of dismantling systems of control. His legacy? Marcuse gave philosophical backing to the idea that love itself can be revolutionary, and that includes the loves society tried hardest to silence. Michel Foucault, born in 1926 in France, is one of the most cited philosophers of the 20th century. He lived openly gay at a time when it was still risky, and much of his work focused on how power shapes knowledge, identity, and even our bodies. His most famous contribution for LGBTQ history came in the history of sexuality. Foucault shows that homosexuality wasn't always seen as an identity. In ancient times, acts mattered, but in the 19th century, science and law rebranded those acts into a category of person, the homosexual. He called this a discourse of power, where institutions like medicine, psychiatry, and the church created labels that defined, judged, and controlled people. Why does this matter? Because it flipped the story. Foucault argued that homosexuality wasn't some eternal sin or natural defect. It was socially constructed as deviant by those in power. And if it was constructed, it could be deconstructed. That insight became intellectual fuel for LGBTQ activism. The problem wasn't queer love. The problem was how society pathologized it. Foucault himself died of AIDS in 1984, becoming one of the first public figures linked to the epidemic. Yet his influence is everywhere, from queer theory to gender studies to activism. He gave LGBTQ people something no one else had, a powerful philosophical weapon to say, "We are not broken. Society made us look broken." His legacy is simple but seismic. Foucault helped queer theory see identity as freedom, not a defect, and showed that resisting unjust power begins by rewriting the words used to define us. Judith Butler, born in 1956 in Ohio, is one of the most influential philosophers in the world today when it comes to gender and queer identity. Their groundbreaking book, Gender Trouble, 1990, forever changed how we think about gender. Here's the core idea. Gender isn't something we're born into and then naturally express. It's performative, a set of repeated actions, behaviors, and roles that society teaches us to act out. For Butler, there's no single real man or real woman. Gender is constructed. It's a script. And if it's constructed, it can also be rewritten, challenged, or even refused. This framework gave LGBTQ people, especially trans and non-binary communities, a powerful language. There's nothing unnatural about stepping outside traditional categories because those categories are inventions in the first place. Butler showed that identity is flexible, lived, and valid wherever you land. The impact has been enormous. Butler's ideas didn't just stay in classrooms. They filtered into activism, pride movements, and legal debates worldwide. Whether people know Butler by name or not, arguments about gender fluidity and queer legitimacy often trace directly back to their philosophy. In a world where laws and cultures still try to enforce rigid gender roles, Butler's work remains revolutionary. Their legacy is clear. You're not bound by a script you didn't write. Gender is yours to play, to bend, and to live truthfully. Martha Nussbaum, born in 1947 in New York, is a living philosopher whose work directly shaped legal and political arguments for LGBTQ equality. She's best known for her capabilities approach, which asks a simple but powerful question. What basic freedoms and opportunities does every human need in order to live a dignified, flourishing life? For Nussbaum, the answer includes love, intimacy, and the ability to define your own identity. In her book Sex and Social Justice, 1999, she argued that denying LGBTQ people the ability to love openly strips them of core human capabilities. In other words, it's not just a private issue. It's an issue of justice and equality at the deepest moral level. Her philosophy has had real-world impact. In the 1990s, she played a direct role in U.S. court cases, including Romer versus Evans, where the Supreme Court struck down anti-gay discrimination in Colorado. Her testimony dismantled so-called moral arguments against homosexuality by showing they were rooted in disgust, not reason. That legal reasoning later influenced cases leading up to nationwide marriage equality. The long-term impact? Nussbaum gave LGBTQ rights a foundation that goes beyond tolerance or preference. She anchored them in universal dignity. Her work reminds us that equal love isn't a luxury. It's a capability every human being must have in order to live a full and flourishing life. Kwame Anthony Appiah, born in London in 1954 to a Ghanaian father and British mother, is a philosopher who bridges cultures. His work focuses on ethics, identity, and what it means to live together in a diverse world. He became famous through his ideas on cosmopolitanism, the belief that every human being deserves moral concern and respect, regardless of nationality, culture, or identity. For LGBTQ history, Appiah's contributions are crucial. In his book, The Ethics of Identity, he argues that identities, whether racial, religious, or sexual, are not prisons but frameworks we can shape. For him, being gay, bi, trans, or queer is simply one legitimate way of living a human life. He rejects the idea that tradition or culture can justify excluding people, reminding us that customs themselves evolve. What makes Appiah powerful is how he takes the global view. He shows that prejudices against LGBTQ people aren't timeless truths, but social constructs rooted in fear. And he insists respect across difference is possible without erasing those differences. In short, your identity is yours, but your dignity is everyone's responsibility to uphold. His long-term impact is ongoing. As societies debate multiculturalism and LGBTQ rights, Appiah's philosophy offers a roadmap. Genuine freedom comes not from forcing sameness, but from honoring difference within our shared human community. His legacy is clear. He gives LGBTQ equality not just a national argument, but a universal one.